Greetings, folks. My name is Ron Gamgee, and welcome to Quick and Dirty Roleplaying. I wanted to continue where I left off in my last video, where I talked about trying to get my past friend group to play Mutants Masterminds with me, some impressions of Mutants Masterminds 2nd Edition, and some memories of when I ran it for a previous tabletop role-playing group. Mutants Masterminds 2nd Edition was probably the edition where I purchased the most supplements. The ones that stuck out the most to me were the Masterminds Manual, Ultimate Power, the Pocket Player's Guide, and the Paragon's Campaign Setting. The Masterminds Manual was a supplement aimed at Game Masters, as they would be the ones who would make the most use out of it. For each chapter of the core rulebook, there was a collection of options and advice for people who wanted to change up their Mutants and Masterminds games within the Masterminds Manual. Among the more notable options to me were the use of hit points, energy points, its first iteration of creating your own power effects, and corruption mechanics. It provided a great window into how the game was designed and in what ways the fundamentals can be tweaked and adjusted to run Mutants and Masterminds in the way you want it to. I dabbled in a few of these options myself, mainly a variation of the hit point option, because getting one-shotted by a bad toughness save and having to hoard hero points just to re-roll on toughness saves just didn't feel very heroic in actual practice. Speaking of great windows into how the game was designed, my favorite supplement in this regard was Ultimate Power. While Mutants and Masterminds 2nd Edition did provide a lot of power effects, there were a significant number of them that were just straight up powers, like Blast and Force Field. Ultimate Power strips the effect-based power system down to its fundamentals. For example, Blast is actually the damage effect with the ranged modifier, and Force Field is actually the armor effect with a sustained duration, which means that if you were unable to perform a free action, the effect would deactivate. Ever since that supplement, whenever I created characters or someone else was creating a character in my game, I would use Ultimate Power instead of the Powers chapter from the core rulebook to create powers. This supplement played a big role in the creation of the 3rd edition of the game, which I'll get to later on. The Pocket Player's Guide is a version of the Mutants and Masterminds 2nd Edition with all the Game Master stuff removed from it in a 6x9-inch paperback format that had a retail price of $20, so it was half off of Mutants and Masterminds 2nd Edition core rulebook. This made it an excellent product for me to recommend to people who are interested in playing Mutants and Masterminds 2nd Edition, since it hit the wallet lighter than the core rulebook. It was also more manageable to carry around, which I did so that I wouldn't damage my core rulebook that I just don't own anymore, which is ironic. And I also happened to purchase multiple versions of these so I can lend out to other people and also give as a gift. The Paragon's Campaign Setting was Green Ronin's second Mutants and Masterminds campaign setting. I think it was inspired by popular superhero media at the time, and I think one of the biggest inspirations of it was the TV show Heroes. My friend group and I, back in that day, we were heavily into Heroes at the time, and so this made this campaign setting a huge draw for me. Unlike Freedom City, Paragon's was a looser campaign setting in the sense that its background elements were more malleable, allowing each group to custom tailor what they wanted their Paragon's setting to be. It still had a roster of great NPCs, such as the Patriot, which is an all-American Superman whose power was tied into how much the public believed in him. There was the House That Hate Built, which was an actual haunted house but built like a character, and the Necropolitan, which is like a dark apocalyptic figure who was among the most powerful NPCs in that setting. If I recall correctly, I actually had used some of the NPCs in that book for my Freedom City campaign, just spice things up. Mutants Masterminds 2nd edition kept me busy and content for a while when all of a sudden there was mention of a DC Universe RPG being developed by Green Ronin Publishing, and they were going to use the DC license to introduce the 3rd edition of Mutants Masterminds. I was like, what the F? How could they make this game any better? I was on the edge of my seat with excitement with what they were going to do for the next iteration of the game. Mind you, to me, seeing the most iconic DC characters statted up in Mutants Masterminds was just an added bonus, as I never had much of an interest in running a campaign in the DC universe. When I received the DC Adventures Heroes Handbook, I thought it was curious that they'd chosen a smaller than typical size for the book, 7.5 by 11 inches. The cover art was beautiful, and it used the art of Alex Ross of Kingdom Come fame. The art inside was also great, as it was art from various DC comic book artists. Top-notch stuff. As far as the rule changes were concerned, it was in large part a rearrangement of how things were done in Mutants Masterminds 2nd edition, while incorporating the power creation approach of the Ultimate Power Supplement and expanding upon that design principle. One of the biggest examples in this regard was the Affliction effect. Affliction is an effect that you would use if you wanted to build a power that did stuff to a target other than damage. In Mutants Masterminds 2nd edition, there were various powers that each would do its own specific status effect, per se, whereas Affliction just consolidated that onto one power. So when you're building an Affliction-based power, you decide which defense, not saving throw, the target used to resist it, as well as the status conditions the target would be afflicted if they failed their defense roll by 1 to 5, 6 to 10, and 11 or lower. So if you wanted to have an Ice Blast that would root the target in place, you could have it so it was usable at range, resisted by the Fortitude defense, and the effects would be hindered, which would half your movement, immobilized, which would reduce your movement rate to 0, and paralyzed, encased in an ice block. So they're set like that, like hindered, mobilized, paralyzed, based on like how badly you failed your Fortitude defense roll. If you wanted more detail, you can apply the progressive modifier so that you can Ice Blast the target again and have the effects accumulate instead of starting from scratch if they were at least hindered or immobilized the first time around. This version of the game really required players to know what they wanted their powers to do, so that either they or a knowledgeable GM, like myself, could help them construct their powers as they envisioned them. To me, building powers was a big part of the enjoyment that I derived from any edition of Mutants and Masterminds, especially the 3rd edition. So I also mentioned that 3rd edition rearranged how things were done in the 2nd edition of Mutants and Masterminds. The first part of this was a more standardized measurements table, which measured mass, time, distance, and volume by rank. Give me a moment so I can actually show you what it looks like. So here's the measurements table there. You see, like from where the spine of where the middle of the book, the page is, you'd have, from rank -5 all the way down to, I think it's 31, even though it can go, even lower or even higher. And you got the different columns. So the base rank was rank 0, where mass was set at 50 pounds, the time unit was 6 seconds, which is 1 combat round, distance was 30 feet, which was a move action, and volume was 1 cubic foot. For every +1 rank beyond rank 0, these measurements doubled, and for every -1 rank below rank 0, these measurements halved. It was a nice simple way of determining how much influence a power has on these measurements based on its rank. One of the problems that I had with this was that it made each rank in strength half as granular as before. So a strength 4 character could lift a max of 800 pounds, whereas in previous editions of the game it was half that much, which was more in line of how D20 characters operated. And speaking of the D20 system, this edition made attempts to distance itself more from its roots this time around. Instead of the traditional 6 abilities, there were now 8 abilities. Fighting was a new core ability, which took care of things like close combat attacking and defending, while dexterity was split into dexterity and agility. Agility took care of whole body reflexes, meaning acrobatics, dodge, and reflex defenses, while dexterity was more hand-eye coordination stuff, like thievery and ranged attacks. Constitution was renamed Stamina, Wisdom was renamed Awareness, Intelligence was renamed Intellect, and Charisma was renamed Presence. This made these characters feel more modern instead of holdovers from D&D. And not only that, they removed the ability score entirely and they simply used ability rank, which would be the equivalent of the ability modifier of previous editions. So instead of the base being at 10, the base would be at 0, which would tie in nicely with the new measurements table. So this made these characters, yeah, I already mentioned that. It still had the issue of having every ability costing the same points per rank, even though some abilities did more than others. Though this is something that I changed simply by making Presence worth half of its normal value, since it only affected 3 skills. Regarding skills, Mutants Masterminds 3rd Edition consolidated their skill list significantly to about half of what it was before. This had the effect of having skills cost twice as much as they did per rank from the 2nd edition, even though not every skill was consolidated. They also made melee and ranged combat for specific attacks or weapons into skills, though this is only useful if you wanted the character to specialize with one attack. If you were to spend points on multiple weapon skills, you'd actually be wasting those points, whereas you can get those points and either put them into fighting or into dexterity, or if you just wanted to be good at hitting things, you can put it into the close or range attack advantages, not feats, advantages. Last but not least, they removed the concept of flaws giving character points to spend, bonus points to spend. Instead, every flaw was a complication, which meant that if it affected you during play, you were awarded a hero point as a consolation prize. Complications were always a thing ever since the 1st edition, so it just seemed like an overall subtraction from the game, along with the omission of knockback rules. As I was writing the script, I was able to relate to the OSR community in wanting to use what was previously established and simply modifying it, rather than replacing something they loved with a newer edition of the game. That's not to say that I didn't enjoy 3rd edition, but it definitely felt like a much less necessary jump than from 1st edition to 2nd edition. Although I can see how getting their hands on the DC license to make another superhero RPG was certainly a good excuse for Green Ronin to update the system to the new edition. It took a while for the official Mutants Masterminds Heroes Handbook, which is this, or rather the previous iteration of this, to release, and for $10 more than the DC Universe's Heroes Handbook, and I didn't really feel compelled to buy it. It had all the same information necessary to create characters and to play the game. Even though the GM sections were somewhat different, with DC being more specially tailored to run games set in the DCU, it just wasn't enough to purchase what was basically a redundant product. I did, however, purchase a copy of the Deluxe Heroes Handbook, which is this, which has a section in Chapter 2 following the character archetypes that provided a way to quickly generate randomized versions of these archetypes. This is fantastic, not only for creating characters quickly, but with more variety as well, because building a character up from scratch, by spending points on every single thing, takes a while, especially for newbies. That and the incorporated errata, for me, it justified the $40 price tag. With that being said, stay tuned for the next episode, where I conclude my history with Mutants Masterminds with the issues that persisted through all editions, or at least my interpretations of them, and some final thoughts on it. Take care, folks, and play to find out what happens.